The late 1930s marked the final terrible sunset of an era. For decades, the pursuit of physics had been a quiet, almost whimsical affair. It was conducted with string and sealing wax in dusty university laboratories. This was an academic pursuit, detached from the gritty concerns of geopolitics. But as the decade closed, physics transitioned with terrifying speed. It moved from a benign academic endeavor into an existential weapon. This fundamentally altered the role of the scientist forever. The first tremors of this change were felt in Paris. In 1934, Irene and Frédéric Joliot-Curie achieved what had once been the ultimate dream of alchemists. They achieved transmutation. Bombarding aluminum foil with alpha particles, Joliot, in a moment of frenzied activity, removed the source. He was astonished when the radioactivity detector continued to register pings of shrapnel for minutes afterward. The aluminum had absorbed the particles and become radioactive itself. This was scientific alchemy made real. Joliot, leaping with joy, exclaimed that they were finally in time. His mother-in-law, Marie Curie, visited the laboratory to witness the glowing apparatus she found in the demonstration, the last great satisfaction of her life. The Joliot-Curies had not just created a new element, they had opened a door, with Frédéric immediately foreseeing explosive consequences. He knew their work could lead to transmutations using a chain reaction. The door was thrown wide open 4 years later. It was opened not by genius alone, but by violence and political persecution. In Berlin, the intense partnership between chemist Otto Hahn and physicist Lise Meitner was violently severed. The cause was Nazi racial laws. Meitner's escape in July 1938 was orchestrated by colleagues. They helped her evade Gestapo agents at the train station. She used Hahn's mother's diamond ring as a potential bribe. She settled cold and lonely in Sweden. Just months later, in mid-December 1938, Hahn wrote to his exiled partner. He described his anomalous results. Uranium was behaving like elements 35 boxes away. This was an impossible leap by existing scientific logic. During a walk in the snow, Meitner had her epiphany. The nucleus had split in half. This was nuclear fission. She immediately recognized that this process would liberate immense energy. She knew it was far more energy than humankind could safely handle. Hahn rushed his paper into print on December 22, 1938. That date marked the moment the world's winter had begun. The news spread with frantic speed. It instantly divided the global physics community into before and after. The chilling implications were soon confirmed. In April 1939, Frédéric Joliot published results showing neutron multiplication. This proved the possibility of an uncontrollable cascade of energy, and thus nuclear bombs. Jewish refugee Leo Szilard, who had conceived of the chain reaction years earlier, pleaded for secrecy. He feared its weaponization by the Third Reich. Enrico Fermi, who had fled fascism in Italy, initially dismissed Szilard's concerns with a sharp nuts. But later, Fermi grew somber. He cupped his hands and murmured about how a little bomb like that could make everything disappear. Hahn, realizing the immensity of the Pandora's box he had opened, contemplated suicide. The painful irony of persecution was clear. The most crucial insight had come from Meitner. An exile, the race to build the weapon would be driven entirely by those scientists Nazism had violently expelled. In Germany, the response was immediate. The formal commitment to nuclear research led to the establishment of the Uranium Club in 1939. For many German scientists, this pursuit was driven by nationalist duty. It was also driven by the simple necessity of securing draft deferments. They sought to avoid being sent to the front for a ghastly project. The Allies, however, were still struggling to grasp the scale of the threat. It took highly motivated individuals, driven by personal crises, to bridge the gap between intelligence and science. Samuel Goldschmidt, a theoretical physicist, was consumed by a far deeper anxiety. His parents, Isaac and Marianne, were trapped in Holland. This fueled his urgent need to extricate them and later drove his involvement in the secret war. Similarly, Mo Berg, the polyglot baseball catcher, found a new purpose. He was motivated by a hatred of Nazi intellectual persecution. He also desperately sought the approval of his recently deceased stern father, Bernard. Berg sought a role in intelligence. He had already demonstrated his peculiar aptitude for espionage years earlier. During his 1934 baseball tour of Japan, he climbed a hospital bell tower. He used the vantage point to film the Tokyo cityscape. This was his espionage audition tape. These men, the guilty academic and the ambitious enigmatic athlete, were among the first to realize the truth. The war would be fought not just with bullets and tanks, but in the realm of the atom. The most abstract of sciences was transforming into the most brutal form of power. The German nuclear program was crippled less by a lack of genius and more by a series of catastrophic scientific and intelligence blunders. Walther Both's monumental boner, his flawed experiment, incorrectly ruled out graphite as a moderator. This forced the Reich to rely entirely on heavy water. The obscure Norsk hydro plant at Vemork thus became the singular most vital strategic target in Europe. This scientific misstep contrasted sharply with the Allied path. On December 2, 1942, in a squash court beneath the University of Chicago, Enrico Fermi achieved a breakthrough. He achieved the first self-sustaining chain reaction. This validated the American approach and turned the abstract threat into a terrifying industrial reality. The Manhattan Project now raced forward, driven by the absolute necessity of denying Germany its reactor juice. The stakes were existential. The initial disastrous attempt to sabotage Vemork, Operation Freshman, had resulted in the execution of 30 British commandos. Worse, it had alerted the Germans to the plant's strategic importance. The Nazis subsequently reinforced the facility. The remote factory, perched on a cliff ledge, was transformed into a fortress. It was complete with floodlights and machine gun nests, but the commitment of the Allies was unwavering. This led to the planning of Operation Gunnercide. The precursor team, Grouse, had already endured months of brutal strain on the Hardangervidda plateau. They fought despair with stolen reindeer lichen and mouldy turnips. When the new team, led by 23-year-old Joachim Ronneberg, finally parachuted in successfully on February 17, 1943, they were met by the Grouse men. They were ragged and fierce, looking less like commandos and more like ghosts emerging from the unrelenting blizzards. For the infiltration, Ronneberg chose the impossible route. It was the 600-foot unguarded gorge, slicked with ice. This bypassed the heavily mined plateau. The descent was a desperate, black-clad ballet of survival. The men clung to the sheer rock face, crossing an ice bridge as slick as oil. Finally, they reached the base of the 8-story facility. It stood as a giant sarcophagus against the night sky, its lights extinguished. The climax of the operation, however, owed less to military precision and more to the near absurdity of human incompetence. Infiltrating the basement via a utility duct, the commandos burst into the heavy water room. This was the heart of the German project. They found it protected not by an SS trooper, but by Gustav. Gustav was a lone, frumpy Norwegian pensioner acting as guard. As the commandos quickly affixed their half-pound sausages of Nobel 808 explosive, Gustav constantly interfered. The explosive carried the faint, sweet scent of almonds. Gustav was oblivious to the danger, warning them about the corrosive lye and the fuses. He demanded attention even as the fate of the war was being decided, feet from his elbow. In the frozen moment of highest tension, Gustav lost his glasses. He demanded a frantic search for them, even as Ronneberg finished wiring the charges. Having set the crude but effective alarm clock timers, the commandos advised the captured guards to keep your mouths open until you hear the blast. They vanished back through the utility duct. They scrambled across the compound. Just as they reached the lip of the gorge, the explosion ripped through the building. It was not the sharp crack of dynamite, but a muffled, deep tectonic boom. The sound was described as all bass and no treble. The blast splintered the 18 fuel cells. It washed 770 pounds of pure heavy water, the critical juice. Ronneberg left a telltale streak of blood in the snow from his injured hand. The 9 men fled into the white chaos of the blizzard. They endured a grueling 2-week, 280-mile cross-country flight to the Swedish border on skis. This desperate dash cemented the operation's success. The sabotage was a critical blow. A German report later confirmed the devastation was total. The unwavering commitment of the Norwegian commandos had successfully transformed the German atomic project. It went from a 2-year lead into a scientific dead end. The Shadow War was fueled by a terrible knowledge gap. This turned Allied intelligence into a fever dream of paranoia. Goebbels' propaganda machine churned out lurid visions of uranium torpedoes and atomic annihilation. Allied leaders struggled to separate fact from Nazi fantasy. This urgent void necessitated the creation of the ALSO's mission in 1943. It was led by the hard-charging intelligence officer Boris Pash and the emotionally vulnerable Samuel Goudsmit. Pash, who once dodged gunfire that splintered a doorframe near his skull, was under immense pressure. His superiors warned him that any slight delay in reaching your targets might cost us tremendous losses, or even the war. The panic intensified thanks to a critical misreading of the evidence. When Niels Bohr escaped occupied Denmark, he relayed his conversation with Werner Heisenberg from 1941. During that meeting, the German physicist had alluded to the possibility of a bomb. Bohr even provided a sketch of what looked like a nuclear reactor. In the high-stress environment of wartime London, this was seized upon. It was misinterpreted as confirmation that Germany was close to success. The urgency of the ALSO's mission went from high to existential. General Leslie Groves, the ruthless manager of the Manhattan Project, became convinced of a terrifying truth. He believed Heisenberg himself was the singular, most dangerous threat on the planet. The Allied strategy shifted from the earlier, fantastical idea of kidnapping the physicist to the cold calculation of assassination. The man chosen for this dark task was Moe Berg. The former baseball catcher had spent months cramming the strangest language he'd ever encountered, quantum mechanics. He was dispatched to neutral Switzerland in late 1944. Berg was the opposite of the brutal commandos originally considered. Groves chose him for his tact, his intellect, and his ability to blend into the academic world. Berg's mission was simple, yet terrifyingly absolute. He was to attend Heisenberg's lecture in Zurich. If the scientist revealed any information confirming Germany possessed atomic capability, Berg was granted permission to kill him. The dapper linguist, who had once discussed strategy in Latin on the field, now carried a loaded pistol and a cyanide L pill. He was poised to decide the future of the war in a freezing lecture hall. He was the ultimate expression of Allied desperation. The gentleman spy was tasked with carrying out a political murder, while the intelligence war focused on the invisible threat of the atom. The very real menace of German rocketry was already raining down on Britain. Operation Hydra, the previous year's massive bombing of the Peenemünde rocket facility, had failed to cripple the V-weapon program. Now, the V-1 flying bombs slammed into London. They were characterized by the dreadful silence after the motor cut. This was followed by a few agonizing seconds of held breath before the inevitable, lethal boom. The need to destroy the massive, heavily fortified coastal bunkers spurred the development of wildly experimental countermeasures. These structures were made of more concrete than the Hoover Dam. The countermeasures were Project Anvil and the Navy's Project Aphrodite. These were flying bombs of the Allied making. They converted war-weary Liberator bombers into remote-controlled missiles packed with 10 tons of high explosive. Among the volunteers for this ultra-hazardous duty was Lieutenant Joseph Kennedy Jr. He was driven by a ferocious ambition and a desperate need to outshine his war hero brother Jack. The pilots lived in miserable, rat-infested conditions at Woodbridge Base. They called new recruits nuts with dark humor that masked the inherent danger of their missions. Joe Jr. had insisted to his family that he was not intending to risk his neck in any crazy venture. Yet the missions were consistently failing, plagued by technical flaws and rushed development. The project was, as one furious general put it, put together with baling wire, chicken guts, and ignorance. Joe Kennedy Jr.'s final flight, piloting the explosive-laden drone Zoot Suit Black on August 12, 1944, was the ultimate expression of this morally ambiguous. The aircraft carried 21,170 pounds of Torpex. This was capable of producing the largest non-nuclear explosion in history up to that point. The plane's arming panel was a hack job, featuring bad soldering and poorly grounded wires. Despite warnings from a concerned lieutenant about the overheating solenoid, Kennedy insisted they obey orders and took off. The solenoid could prematurely detonate the massive payload. The subsequent catastrophe was witnessed by Ada Westgate. She saw a gargantuan green-yellow fireball and a shock wave that shattered windows 9 miles away. This was followed by an octopus of smoke right out of Revelation. No human remains were ever recovered from the site. The Navy launched an intensive investigation. Rather than admitting the technological failures, they actively obfuscated the true cause of the explosion. The project had gone 0 for 18 in its attempts to stop the German threat. It left a stink of defeat on the family legacy. The day after the news arrived, Joe Kennedy Sr., the controversial ambassador who had always feared the war, broke down. His brother Jack pragmatically insisted they go sailing. He claimed Joe would not want them sitting here crying. The Shadow War, fought by spies like Berg, scientists like Goudsmit, and tragically ambitious pilots like Kennedy, had extracted a heavy toll. Yet the primary threat, the atomic capability of the Third Reich, remained unresolved. This drove the Allies forward into the heart of occupied Europe. The ultimate fear, the German atomic bomb, was neutralized not by a blinding flash of light, but by a chilling, quiet act of restraint. In the freezing lecture hall in Zurich, Mo Berg had looked into the face of Werner Heisenberg. The polyglot catcher had a pistol holstered beneath his suit. He saw no fanatic, no mastermind on the verge of victory, but an academic longing for recognition. Berg's decision to choose inaction was the final crucial intelligence report. He stepped back from the brink of political murder. It confirmed that the threat was theoretical, not imminent. This allowed the Allied focus to shift from assassination to acquisition. With the intelligence threat neutralized, Alsos transitioned fully to its second, more ruthless mandate. This was the physical denial of assets. Following the capture of Joliet-Curie in liberated Paris, the mission established its forward headquarters in the city. They set up shop in the once Grand Royal Monceau Hotel. The atmosphere was a bizarre mix of celebration and lingering grief. Boris Pash noted the young Parisian waiters, their borrowed tuxedos hanging loose on their adolescent frames. It was a sobering reminder of the men lost at the front. But Paris was merely a staging post. The real race was now deep inside the crumbling Reich, driven by the dawning certainty of the Cold War. Alsos had already secured the massive critical uranium cache at Stassfurt. This was a colossal heist of £2.2 million of crude ore. It dealt a crushing blow to any potential Soviet atomic program. Pash, whose team now looked like Panto Villa bandits in their commandeered jeeps, operated with a ruthless pragmatism. He prioritized speed and material over diplomacy. He once barked down a French major who dared to delay his convoy, demanding that when a colonel speaks, he assume attention. The German program, meanwhile, was experiencing its final, pathetic collapse. Evacuated south to the Black Forest, Werner Heisenberg had retreated to his cathedral on the cliff. This was in the small village of Haigerloch. Here, in a cool, damp cave known as the Atom Cellar, he conducted the last gasp of the Nazi Manhattan Project. His uranium machine, a primitive setup of 664 uranium cubes dangling in a heavy water vat, was highly unstable. Though the experiment achieved a significant 670% neutron multiplication factor, it failed to reach criticality. It was a scientific near miss, yet an absolute failure. As Allied tanks closed in, the scene was one of desperate absurdity. Heisenberg dismantled his life's work. He hid the precious uranium cubes in a field and sensitive technical documents in a latrine. He then began his perilous 150-mile escape on a bicycle. A Nobel laureate was fleeing the apocalypse on 2 wheels. He traveled at night and gripped the handlebars even while sleeping. He was stopped by an SS guard who recognized his papers as crude forgeries. This sealed his fate for desertion. Heisenberg saved himself not with philosophy or physics, but with a one currency still accepted in the chaotic final days of the Third Reich. It was a single pack of American Pall Malls. The guard, despite his duty, accepted the bribe. He was overpowered by the lure of the smooth American tobacco. Heisenberg reached his family's dilapidated mountain cabin, the Eagle's Nest. It overlooked a cold, clear lake in the idyllic village of Urfeld. But Alsos was already there. On May 2nd, 1945, Colonel Boris Pash and his Lightning A-team stormed the cabin, arresting the physicist. Pash, who moments earlier had been bluffing a German general with 700 troops, faced a final vicious skirmish in the village. It resulted in 2 Nazi deaths and the capture of 15 prisoners. Pasha's men immediately slit the prisoner's trouser waistbands to prevent escape. The chaos was completed when Nazi propagandist Colin Ross, also hiding in the area, poisoned his wife and son before shooting himself. Pash, however, was prevented from personally escorting his prize. A mule, perhaps symbolizing the stubborn resistance of the European landscape, reared up and kicked him in the back, breaking 3 ribs. The culmination of the ALSO's mission was the interrogation of Heisenberg by Samuel Goudsmit. The atmosphere in the holding room was thick with irony and unresolved personal history. Heisenberg, still arrogant and oblivious to the true scale of the American success, enthusiastically recounted his 670% neutron increase. Goudsmit, knowing that the scientists at Los Alamos would laugh at his puny 670, maintained a professional silence. He was unable to reveal that the Manhattan Project had long ago lapped the Uranium Club. Heisenberg, clinging to his old pride, refused Goudsmit's offer to work in America. He insisted, "Germany needs me," the exact, arrogant reply he had given years earlier before the war began. For Goudsmit, the interrogation delivered the final, crushing blow. Max von Laue, another captured scientist, confirmed the terrible truth. Goudsmit's parents had died in Auschwitz on February 11, 1943. Goudsmit then learned the full extent of Heisenberg's moral failure. When Heisenberg had received Dirk Coster's desperate plea to help the elderly couple, he had dithered for weeks. He sent a short, tepid reply stating it would be highly deplorable if Goudsmit's parents, for reasons unknown to me, experienced difficulties in Holland. Goudsmit was horrified by this mealy-mouthed, cowardly bullshit. In that moment, the scientific genius standing before him was revealed as a moral cowardly. Heisenberg had exerted more energy trying to save Jewish physics from Nazi scorn than he had trying to save 2 Jewish lives. The friendship was permanently shattered. The Shadow War concluded not with a bang, but with a profound, agonizing sense of betrayal. The ALSO's mission had succeeded, but the moral cost of victory had only just begun to be tallied. The blinding flash over Hiroshima and Nagasaki did more than end a global conflict. It shattered the old world order. The destructive power that Allied fear had wrought solidified the dawn of the nuclear age. This transformed science forever. Physics was no longer a benign academic pursuit, conducted with string and sealing wax in dusty laboratories. It was now a strategic, existential enterprise. It was deemed too important to leave to the physicists. Government budgets for research ballooned into the millions. The abstract theories that once occupied secluded minds were now the currency of geopolitical power. In splitting the atom, the scientists had also riven the world. For the men who had fought the Shadow War, the victory was hollow. It was replaced by a profound, enduring psychological toll. Samuel Goudsmit returned to Holland to find the physical world mirroring his interior devastation. He walked through The Hague, locating his childhood home and his mother's former hat shop. He found them gutted and gone. The war's end brought not relief, but a crushing sense of guilt. The Nazis' final, most terrible cruelty was to make the victims feel they had punished themselves. Goudsmit's melancholy deepened in the post-war years. He found academia dreadful and provincial. The exciting urgency of the war was replaced by petty university politics. He was a man who had held the fate of the world in his hands, yet he felt increasingly forgotten, even excluded from celebrations honoring his own early scientific discovery. In his later years, Goudsmit reflected bitterly on his journey. His infantile childhood dreams of scientific glory had materialized, but his more important mature wishes for a peaceful moral world had not. The interrogation of Werner Heisenberg had confirmed the physicist's profound moral failure. He was willing to exert more energy saving Jewish physics from Nazi scorn than saving the lives of Goudsmit's parents. The tapes from Farm Hall later revealed the depth of the German scientists' moral confusion. They were profoundly unsettled by the discovery that their internment had been monitored. Yet Heisenberg noted his bafflement that his colleagues found it much worse to be accused of stupidity than of Nazi sympathies, than of collaboration. The moral cowardice of inaction, Goudsmit realized, was compounded by the arrogance of scientific pride. Mo Berg, the spy who had carried a pistol into a freezing lecture hall, refused the Medal for Merit. This symbolized his refusal to be defined by his wartime exploits. The medal, Berg knew, could never account for the ambiguity of his actions or the darkness of his internal struggle. Instead, he kept only two mementos of his clandestine life. They were the loaded pistol and the cyanide L pill he had been issued for suicide. He descended into a paranoid existence. He cut off contact with old friends, letting his appearance slide. He scribbled notes to himself, asking the same tortured question. Would I have disposed of them? He failed to write the memoir that might have defined his legacy. He was haunted by the spectre of the political murder he had nearly committed. Berg found his final, solitary refuge at World Series games. He used his engraved, silver-plated card for lifetime admission to any ballpark. He died quietly in 1972. His final words, fittingly, were a question about the game he could never quite leave behind. How'd the Mets do today? The Alsos veterans, including the hard-charging Boris Pash, maintained a dark camaraderie. Their bond was forged in the madness of the atomic race. They held reunions marked by boozy parties and golf scrambles. This shared experience connected them to the one great, necessary terror of their lives. Pash, who had once celebrated victory by performing a traditional Russian dance fueled by looted wine, transferred to Tokyo. He later joined the nascent CIA, forever drawn to the shadows of intelligence. The Alsos mission had succeeded in its primary task. It prevented Hitler from obtaining the bomb, but the price of success was the permanent alteration of the human condition. In splitting the atom, they had not just ended the war, they had forever riven the world.